Critical assessment. Poilievre's CPC Law and Order Platform versus International Evidence Executive Summary. This assessment critically examines Pierre Poilievre's Conservative Party of Canada, CPC Law and Order Platform against international evidence on crime and violence reduction from Western democracies. The analysis reveals that Poilievre's common-sense policies on sentencing reforms and drug policy diverge significantly from evidence-based approaches that have proven effective in reducing crime and drug-related harms in comparable Western democracies. The platform's emphasis on punitive sentencing, criminalization of drug possession, opposition to harm reduction, and abstinence-only treatment mirrors failed American approaches rather than successful models from countries like Portugal, the Netherlands, and the Czech Republic. Despite being framed as common sense, these policies are contradicted by substantial evidence showing they are likely to be ineffective at best and counterproductive at worst. Key findings on sentencing reforms. Consecutive sentencing and the notwithstanding clause. Poilievre's proposal. Reintroduce consecutive life sentences for multiple murderers by invoking the notwithstanding clause, Section 33 of the Charter. Evidence gap. Research shows no compelling evidence that longer sentences deter crime or improve public safety. The Netherlands imprisons its citizens at 1/10 the American per capita rate without experiencing higher crime rates. European countries favor rehabilitation and resocialization over punishment. Percent of the world's life without parole prisoners are in American prisons, demonstrating the exceptional nature of this approach. A growing body of evidence has undermined long-perceived links between public safety and the length of prison sentences. Germany's Prison Act specifically states that the purpose of incarceration is to help prisoners lead lives of social responsibility free of crime upon release. Effectiveness. Assessment. This proposal represents a significant departure from evidence-based approaches in most Western democracies. The use of the notwithstanding clause to implement a policy not supported by evidence raises serious concerns about both effectiveness and constitutional governance. The evidence suggests that focusing on rehabilitation rather than extended punishment would be more effective at reducing recidivism and improving public safety. 3 strikes. Law Poilievre's proposal. Implement a 3 strikes and you're out law for repeat serious offenders, with anyone having 3 major convictions facing at least 10 years in prison, being labeled a dangerous offender, and being denied bail, probation, house arrest, or parole. Evidence gap. Research finds that 3 strikes policies have had very limited impacts in jurisdictions where they've been implemented. By 1998, 2/3 of U.S. states with 3 strikes laws had only used it a dozen or fewer times. The law is very rarely used in the majority of states that have a law by that name. 3 strikes laws are described as a paradigm instance of American exceptionalism in punishment. These laws are not widely adopted in other Western democracies, which favor more rehabilitative approaches. Research examining the impact of 3 strikes found only one variable that seemed to be affected in California: an increase in the proportion of older inmates in prison. Effectiveness. Assessment. Poilievre's proposed 3 strikes law mimics a failed American approach that research shows has had limited impact on crime rates while contributing to mass incarceration. The evidence suggests this policy would be ineffective at reducing crime while potentially increasing correctional costs and human suffering. The policy also removes judicial discretion, which is a key component of effective justice systems in other Western democracies. Mandatory minimum sentences. Poilievre's proposal. Implement escalating mandatory minimum sentences for fraud and drug offenses, including mandatory life sentences for anyone caught with 40 milligrams of fentanyl. Evidence gap. Widespread evidence shows that mandatory minimum sentences produce substantial harm with no overall benefit to crime control. Mandatory minimums represent a uniquely American approach to sentencing that has accelerated prison growth. They constrain judicial discretion, deepen racial disparities in the criminal legal system, and cause far-reaching harm to individuals, families, and communities. A range of criminal legal experts from ideologically diverse backgrounds maintain that mandatory minimums are an overly harsh, disproportionate response. The deterrence rationale underpinning mandatory minimum sentences has not been supported by evidence. Rather than eliminate discretion in sentencing, mandatory minimums moved this power from judges to prosecutors. Effectiveness assessment. Poilievre's mandatory minimum sentence proposals run counter to evidence from Western democracies showing these approaches are ineffective at reducing crime while producing substantial collateral damage to communities. The proposal for mandatory life sentences for possession of small amounts of fentanyl, 40 milligrams, is particularly disconnected from evidence-based approaches and would likely exacerbate rather than alleviate the opioid crisis. Key findings on drug policies. Criminalization of drug possession. Poilievre's proposal. Oppose decriminalization of personal possession and implement harsh penalties for drug offenses. Evidence gap. Countries that have adopted less punitive policies toward drug possession have not experienced any significant increases in drug use, drug-related harm, or crime relative to more punitive countries. A World Health Organization study found that the U.S. had the highest lifetime drug use rates by a wide margin, despite its punitive policies. The UN Development Program found that criminalization approaches have had little effect in eradicating production or problematic drug use, and have harmful collateral consequences. Portugal's decriminalization model has shown no major increases in drug use, reduced rates of problematic drug use, fewer people incarcerated, reduced HIV/AIDS rates, and reduced drug-induced deaths. U.S. jurisdictions with reduced penalties do not have higher rates of drug use. Many have slightly lower rates and higher treatment admission rates. In practice, decriminalization means that otherwise law-abiding people are no longer arrested, let alone incarcerated, merely for possessing a drug effectiveness assessment. Poilievre's opposition to decriminalization contradicts substantial evidence from Western democracies, showing that decriminalization approaches are more effective at reducing drug-related harms without increasing drug use. The evidence suggests his approach would be ineffective at reducing drug use while exacerbating related harms, including overdose deaths, HIV/AIDS transmission, and barriers to treatment access. Opposition to harm reduction. Poilievre's proposal. Prevent provinces from opening overdose prevention sites, cut funding to supervised consumption sites and prescribed alternatives programs, and fire bureaucrats who support prescribed alternatives. Evidence gap. The Czech Republic has integrated harm reduction into its drug policy and has lower addiction rates than the US and much of Western Europe. The Netherlands has lower addiction rates, lower heroin overdose rates, and lower prevalence of injection drug use compared to more punitive countries. Benefits of harm reduction approaches include reducing criminal justice costs, redirecting resources to health systems, diminishing racial disparities, minimizing social exclusion, and improving treatment uptake. Major health organizations, including the World Health Organization, American Public Health Association, and Organization of American States, support harm reduction approaches. A substantial body of evidence shows the effectiveness of harm reduction in reducing drug-related deaths and disease transmission. The World Health Organization recommends that countries work toward developing policies and laws that decriminalize injection and other use of drugs, and thereby reduce incarceration. Effectiveness assessment. Poilievre's opposition to harm reduction approaches directly contradicts evidence from Western democracies showing these approaches are effective at reducing drug-related harms, improving public health outcomes, and reducing costs to the criminal justice system. His proposal to eliminate these programs would likely increase overdose deaths and HIV/AIDS transmission, contradicting the evidence-based approaches recommended by major international health organizations. Abstinence-only treatment. Poilievre's proposal. Introduce abstinence-only treatment and reject medication-assisted treatment approaches. Evidence gap. Countries with successful drug policies have expanded access to a range of treatment options, including medication-assisted treatment. Portugal significantly expanded treatment and harm reduction services alongside decriminalization, leading to a significant increase in the number of people receiving treatment. The Czech Republic has integrated low-threshold opioid substitution treatment and syringe access programs into its drug policy. Evidence shows that medication-assisted treatment is highly effective for opioid use disorders. Abstinence-only approaches have high relapse rates compared to comprehensive treatment models. Combining the removal of criminal penalties with the use of alternative therapeutic responses to dependent drug users can reduce the burden of drug law enforcement on the criminal justice system. Effectiveness assessment. Poilievre's focus on abstinence-only treatment ignores evidence from Western democracies showing that a comprehensive approach including medication-assisted treatment and harm reduction is more effective at addressing substance use disorders. This policy gap would likely result in higher relapse rates and continued drug-related harms, contradicting the evidence-based approaches that have proven successful in other countries. Rhetorical analysis. Common sense. Framing Poilievre's approach presents policies as common-sense approaches to crime and public safety. Evidence gap. Expert consensus from criminal justice researchers, international organizations, and public health authorities contradicts the common-sense framing. Western democracies outside the United States generally favor shorter sentences, greater judicial discretion, more emphasis on rehabilitation, less emphasis on punishment, alternatives to incarceration, and reintegration of offenders. Evidence-based approaches often contradict intuitive common-sense solutions in complex policy areas. The British Medical Journal notes that most serious commentators call for decriminalization, that is, downgrading of the status of personal drug use, so that using drugs is not a crime or is a lesser one. Assessment. Poilievre's framing of his policies as common sense appears to be a rhetorical device that masks the lack of evidence supporting these approaches. This framing may appeal to intuitive notions of justice, but diverts attention from the substantial evidence contradicting these policies. The evidence suggests that what is often presented as common sense in criminal justice policy may actually be counterproductive when measured against outcomes. Woke criticism. Poilievre's approach characterizes liberal approach as a woke criminal justice agenda that makes streets less safe. Evidence gap. Countries with less punitive approaches to both sentencing and drug policy have not seen increases in crime or drug use. The UN Development Program notes that criminalization approaches have harmful collateral consequences, including creating criminal black markets, fueling corruption and violence, and threatening public health and safety. Evidence-based approaches are supported by research, not ideological positions. Human Rights Watch notes that drug control policies that impose criminal penalties for personal drug use undermine basic human rights. Subjecting people to criminal sanctions for the personal use of drugs or for possession of drugs for personal use infringes on their autonomy and right to privacy. Assessment. Poilievre's use of woke as a pejorative term to describe evidence-based approaches to criminal justice and drug policy appears to be a political framing device rather than a substantive critique. This rhetoric may polarize debate and hinder evidence-based policy development. The evidence suggests that approaches characterized as woke may actually be more effective at reducing crime and drug-related harms than punitive approaches. Conclusion. This critical assessment reveals significant gaps between Poilievre's CPC law and order platform and international evidence on effective approaches to crime and violence reduction. The platform largely mirrors failed American-style punitive approaches while ignoring evidence-based models that have proven successful in other Western democracies. The evidence from countries like Portugal, the Netherlands, and the Czech Republic demonstrates that less punitive, more health-centered approaches to both sentencing and drug policy can achieve better outcomes in terms of reducing crime, drug use, and related harms. Poilievre's platform, despite being framed as common sense, runs counter to this evidence and risks exacerbating the very problems it aims to address. A truly evidence-based approach to law and order would incorporate lessons from successful models in Western democracies, including greater judicial discretion in sentencing rather than mandatory minimums, emphasis on rehabilitation and reintegration rather than punishment, decriminalization of drug possession for personal use, comprehensive harm reduction services, diverse treatment options, including medication-assisted treatment. By diverging from these evidence-based approaches, Poilievre's platform appears more aligned with political positioning than with effective policy for reducing crime and violence in Canada. The international evidence is clear. Punitive approaches to sentencing and drug policy are less effective than health-centered, rehabilitative approaches at achieving the stated goals of reducing crime and violence.